Hello, I'm Abbie Grotke, Library of Congress, IIPC chair this year, and I am kicking off session 18, Access Promotion Policy, and it is our final session, and before we have one more panel talk. So you probably already know the drill, but we wanted to just remind you again that we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A once we get started, and you can keep them anonymous if you want to. You can upvote questions if you want us to be sure to cover them. And also just a reminder that each session will be recorded, so anything you say can and will be used against you in the future now. I think that's it in terms of the reminders. Now I can introduce our speakers. We're going to have some brief introductions to the talks, and I hope you have had a chance to watch the excellent videos for this session. First up, we have Ben Els, and then Nicola Bingham and Jefferson Bailey, who I think you all know very well at this point. So Ben, do you want to give us a little overview of your talk?
Yes, thank you, Abbie. So basically in my talk, I went over our plans of how to draw more attention to the Luxembourg Web Archive in general. And I mentioned a few points in this approach. So basically, I started with explaining that we are not going to stress too much the legal deposit basis of the Web Archive, but rather focus on the service to website owners and to content creators. I would also like to stress the collaboration with different user or interest groups, which is crucial in improving the coverage and utility of the Web Archive for everyone. And then I am also explaining the different methods we use, from the domain crawls to event and thematic crawls, how one method is going to build on the other in forming the basis for different collections. And I'm also explaining that maybe people might not be interested in the explanation that we try to harvest everything from the Luxembourg Web. People are not interested in everything on the internet, and maybe a question that all of us have heard before, well, is it really worth to capture all of these websites? Is it really necessary? And therefore special collections are a good way of highlighting not the websites, but a topic or an event which is represented on the web. So yeah, that's my short recap.
Thank you. Somebody just started a lawnmower across the street. So apologies if you can hear that. Next up is Nicola.
Thank you, Abbie. In my presentation, I talk about some of the considerations informing our policy of setting up third-party web archiving tools at the UK Web Archive. We've been experimenting with WebRecorder. However, this is a diversion for us from our usual workflow because we have Heritrix very much baked into the whole web archiving infrastructure. And as a consortium of national libraries, we operate under legal deposit legislation. So there are restrictions not only about what is in scope for us, but how we carry out the archiving process. For example, we can only archive websites from an IP address dedicated for the purpose of making requests. So the spirit of the law is that the crawler should be identified as originating from a legal deposit library. And in practice, this means that web hosted tools can't be used for our legal deposit collecting. So we want to roll out use of WebRecorder more widely. It will, we feel, enable diverse individuals and communities to contribute content to the Web Archive. So it will make our collection more inclusive, but we also need to verify those WARCs to make sure they're in scope for us. There is no private content or personal data in the WARC files, and also create metadata for discovery. So we're looking at creating these policies around the use of a WebRecorder and other third-party web archiving tools. and how we might in the future set them up to crawl under non-print legal deposit regulations. And in case I don't get chance, can I please say thank you to Anissa Hawes, Ilya Kramer and the WebRecorder team, Gil Hogarth and Carlos Lelkesh Rarugal for their work in this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. And up next, we have Jefferson Bailey from the Internet Archive.
Abbie. Also wanted to note related to web archiving pets that I actually had my pet in my presentation, so just upping the ante there. And similar to Abbie's dog, I also took my afternoon melatonin pill today. Joke. So our video was about a project we actually presented on, I believe in 2019 IIPC conference when it was just starting off. And this is a project of archiving approaches, but also web archiving technologies and tool stacks to ensure the preservation of a specific tranche of at-risk content, which in this case was scholarly literature, specifically journal articles that are open access and that are published on the web. So we had two sort of approaches that started the project, which is a sort of top-down approach, which is how can we use the rich ecosystem of scholarly communications, things like DOIs, other aggregators, institutional repositories, similar services, and how can we use those as signals for what is open access on the web in scholarly literature and scholarly outputs, and use those signals to go out and collect it. And once we've collected it, do all sort of metadata enrichment and all kind of things like that. Lots of details in the slides, which I'll put in the chat around partnerships and tools and architectural diagrams, stuff like that. The other was we probably already have a lot of scholarly literature in the Wayback Machine. So how can we look backwards and identify that stuff through machine learning approaches to then extract it and include it in this corpus. So that was the project. And we then did another phase of the project, which sort of led to better access and visibility tools. And so we launched, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago or so, scholar.archive.org, which you can go and look at. Behind that is sort of the huge union catalog that summarizes all this work, which is called Fat Cat, Big Catalog. And at the end of the day, it is sort of a layer on top of the web archive that allows for better search and discovery of a specific type of content, in this case, scholarly literature. We are also moving into other phases of the work, which is around citation interlinkage, making sure we get things like data sets and software and code and things that are not the published version of record of a scholarly project or scholarly work, but are instead sort of secondary outputs, and then doing other partnership development, which we've blogged about and stuff like that. So wanted to obviously also give a shout out to Brian Newbold, who's the main engineer on the project, as well as Martin Seigan, who also is another engineer on the project. And finally, shout out to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which has given us multiple rounds of funding to pursue this work. That's it, thanks.
Great, and if everybody can join me on stage, we can get started with the Q&A. And again, as a reminder, just put any questions you have in the Q&A section and we'll work through them. We have quite a bit of time here. So thank you all. And I wanted to start by just saying, you know, it seems like all three of you have touched on various aspects of collaborating with external partners or people that have data sources that you're using, or researchers who have a random spreadsheet of all the work that they've put into an archive, which is fabulous. And I'm just curious if there's more that you could share about lessons learned with using some of these external data sources or involving organizations or people from the outside who might be contributing to the archives or helping you make sense of what's in your archive. Any thoughts about that from your various perspectives?
So maybe I have, oh, sorry, Nicola. So maybe there's a kind of specific aspect in Luxembourg is that if something is talked about on the radio or in the newspaper, then people find it much, much more interesting than before, even though they were already concerned by it before. But then if if it's on the radio, then it's more important. And I think that's something with special collections. Each time we had a call for participation, and if the radio station picked that up, and even if we just had a short interview, that immediately caused for a lot more people to contact us to send in their seeds. And people want to be part of these topics, of these events. They want to share what they have to contribute, and yeah, you just have to reach them in the right way, and I think that's a good way to do it.
So I would say one of the lessons that we've learned is to build relationships with our curators and our partners ahead of time. One collection that we wanted to run last year was after the murder of George Floyd, and there were ripples around the world in terms of Black Lives Matter and anti-racism protest. We wanted to reflect that event in the UK, so we reached out to those organisations and contacts who were best placed really to help advise us in selecting content for that material. The problem was we timed that spectacularly badly, because these organisations obviously had a lot to deal with at that time, and way down the list of their considerations were web archiving. Whereas with other partners where we've previously built up relationships and said, this is what web archiving is, we'd value your input, we can then call on them when we need to. So, for example, we worked with the Wellcome Trust in London and the Royal Colleges of Health in the UK to select content around the coronavirus pandemic, but that was really only possible because we had relationships with those organisations previously. So timing is really crucial.
Yeah, I would maybe add that something that was really critical to our work, maybe not a lesson learned per se, but an advocacy thing for us in the web archiving world, is that we were really benefited from the move for open infrastructure, especially in the scholarly communications world. So lots of folks have open APIs, so Crossref or DataCite. There's lots of open repositories. Just openness in the scholarly communications world is a huge topic right now, not just open access to content, but also the openness of infrastructure and services and integrations and interoperability and all these things. And we really benefited from that. And it was a useful reminder. We didn't go into our project thinking like we need to do more web archiving. It was, you know, we want to improve our archive of scholarly materials, and web archiving was the best way to do that. And so I think it's useful for us in the web archiving world to remember that we are part of open scholarly infrastructure, tools and services that we maintain and build, and the access platforms that we host. Those are just as critical to that world. And, you know, archiving and preservation is not, you know, the end game of scholarly communications, but it's a huge piece of it. And I think those doing web archiving are critical to its success. And web archiving have always been very open source and open infrastructure minded. So I think we have a good role to play, and we also benefit from the larger movement out, you know, beyond just archives.
I really liked how you all were using what was already archived, basically, right? So you're using the data to find what's buried in the archives. And I think a lot of us are thinking about what are all the hidden gems in our archives that we could expose or illuminate or raise more awareness about. And that got me to thinking about Ben's curiosities that you have on your website. And I really love the featuring a few different way to look at the archive. And I'm just curious if you had how that came about and what got you thinking about presenting the archive like that or talking about it like that.
Yeah, I think one story is due to Case, who is, I think he's here as well, from the WARCnet challenge. So he had this Twitter WARCnet challenge, and there was somewhere back in my memory this weird website that we found once, but yeah, it was just a joke between maybe Eve and me. And then Case was asking, like, what is the weirdest website you can come up with? So we did this Twitter challenge, and then, oh well, the story did well. People liked it, so let's put it on the website. I think it doesn't have to be just numbers and we have this and this many terabytes and everything. People are interested in that as well, maybe, but it can also be just one small joke somewhere. And
yes, I liked your, the idea of making your collections not boring. And I think some of us have been trying to do that with Web Archive Wednesday a little bit, but from where I said, it's a little hard to like come up with the really fun things to share out. So I like seeing that. So Nicola, before we get to questions, I was curious about the WebRecorder use and the accounts. You talked a lot about giving accounts to some of the curators or other people, not just the web archiving team. Did I get that right? And curious how many people you're thinking about expanding, if you could, or if you have, and if you have any concerns about that, or is that sort of the decentralizing of the web archiving activity? Because I know your structure is similar to ours, and thinking about, like, it's a very centralized activity right now. So curious to hear more about that.
Absolutely. So the vision would be that we had a whole army of curators, in every walk of life, all at home, archiving content for us with WebRecorder and submitting that content, and it would have fantastic metadata and it would all be compliant. The tension that we have is about this legislative framework, and the fact, for a start, we're only mandated to archive UK content, which is it's difficult to express that kind of territoriality onto the web. It's also very, very easy for users when they're using WebRecorder to inadvertently archive perhaps social media content that could be constituted as private, or to accidentally archive passwords and login credentials. So we have a whole range of criteria against which we would want to verify WARC content. So for this reason, we've got the ambition to open up our curation as widely as possible, because we feel that within the national libraries we have a good subject knowledge, but we perhaps operate a little bit of a top-down approach, and what we want to embed more is a bottom-up approach, so that those communities that we're talking about can archive their own content. And that has to be balanced against the particular legislative framework in which we operate, and our reputational standing as the National Library. So one interesting thing actually that we've found is that colleagues within the legal deposit libraries have actually been picking up WebRecorder and using it independently of web archiving. So colleagues that we don't normally deal with very much have said, actually, I've used this fantastic tool, I've archived my own website, I've archived this content, would you like to have it? So there's this kind of groundswell of support for WebRecorder, which we'd like to capitalize on. It's just a question of us codifying this policy and making it easy for us to verify these WARCs before we ingest them.
And to sort of follow on to that, when you were talking about the researcher or the person who had donated the collection to you, and it had a manifest, and I was really intrigued by that, and whether or not that was something you asked for, or was that something that they just had, and would it be useful to serve as a model to others? I mean, I know some donations of content you have no control over what they give you, but if we could think about ways to request that kind of information if people are thinking about donating to web archives.
Absolutely. So this was a best practice example, and the case study that you're referring to, Abbie, was work done by Anissa Hawes. Anissa is an independent researcher and archivist. She'd been commissioned by the Imperial War Museum to archive their websites and their social media content. So we were very, very lucky that this was a kind of a sort of a three-way joining up. So Anissa, the archivist who had spent months and months and months very methodically archiving and documenting this content, had suggested to the content creators, the Imperial War Museum, that a good repository could be the UK Web Archive. And we were very, very delighted to accept this high fidelity content, which had archived social media content in a much more fine-grained, detailed way than we could achieve. And so we were just very, very lucky that it was Anisa's practice that she'd from her archival background, that she had created the manifest, not only of all of the URLs and the objects that she'd archived, but of the journey she took through the website as a WebRecorder user, which is important, I think, if as a user of that content you are you're disconnected from how the archivist experienced that website. That contextual information written down is really, really valuable to explain the contextual information to the user. So certainly have a look at Anisa Hawes. Anisa has a GitHub site. Have a look at that, and we'll certainly be promoting that kind of detailed documentation as best practice.
Great, fabulous. All right, let's jump to some of the questions here. Let's go with the first. It's for everybody. To what extent have your web archive collections been cited in academic publications? Do you use citations in your web archive sites to facilitate this? Do you want to take that first, Jefferson, and then we'll go around?
Sure. Since we're archiving academic literature and academic literature cites other academic literature, I'm going to presume that it's but there are tools in the IA Scholar interface for, click button to create citation in whatever format. So there is a little bit of that. For context on the citations with the corpus, we're currently working on doing the citation graph. So every citation from every scholarly thing that we've archived, and it's well over 1 billion citations at this point. So we will be releasing that as an open data set sometime in the near future for people to crunch on. So that might get cited itself as a database or a data object or something. Generally, since we're archiving scholarly stuff, it's citing other scholarly stuff, so it's a little hard to answer, but yes.
It's a big circle, a loop. Ben,
it's a big hairball. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think maybe a challenge for our web archive in, let's say, being attractive for scientific research is that it's quite young. So we only go back 5 years in our web archive, but this is also changing now with our collaboration with the University of Luxembourg, with Valérie Schaffer, with Frédéric Claver, who are doing an amazing job in just getting their collaborators and getting researchers on their side interested, and just forming plenty of research projects and initiatives, which we are really happy to be a part of, because we also need this exchange, of course, this connection to the researchers, to know what will be the questions that they are interested in, what are the ways they are interested in using the web archive. So I'm really happy that there are bigger projects to come there.
I'm glad that Ben and Jefferson answered this question first, because my answer is a little bit shorter. We struggle with citations in the UK Web Archive with our reading room access. So the vast majority of our collection is only accessible on legal deposit library premises, and on our terminals we have all kinds of checks and balances to make sure that people can't copy that material out. To the extent that they can't copy out citations, they can't copy out the URL reference from a browser there in the reading room. So it's something that we're struggling with, because it's a little bit of a catch-22 situation. We want academics to be able to cite the web archive, but it's difficult for them to do this. We have been referenced in academic publications, but we haven't got a standard way yet of those references being cited.
Great. Okay, let's go to question 2 from Brenda. For Jefferson, how did you decide which scholarly materials were most at risk?
Yeah, excellent question. There's a couple of different signals that we're using. Probably the main one is the Keepers Registry is an organization of, forget how many, maybe 13 or 15 institutions, including Library of Congress and places like Clocks and Portico and services that are focused on scholarly communications. And each institution publishes its preservation holdings in a format called a KBART report. Don't know what that stands for, but fun to say. And so we can use that information so we have collected, know whether it's in KBART reports, so somebody else has a copy. In general, we're going to be keeping a copy anyway. So that stuff is not at risk because a preservation institution has decided to archive it and is attesting that they have archived, you know, maybe these years of a journal or something like that. There's other sort of registries like Sherpa Romeo is a sort of service that attests to whether the open access / license status. So whether something's open access, web published, we can look at the publisher. Even if it's open access, something like from Elsevier is probably not at risk, whereas something that is not, even if it's OA, is not in a commercial publisher is more likely to be. So there's sort of metrics, and then like where is it located? You know, some countries are more likely not to have preservation baked into their publishing thinking as much as wealthier countries would be. So sort of signals like that. And we, you know, I forget what the exact stat is, but I know that we have well over 10 million scholarly articles identified that are not in the Keepers Registry that we archived from the web. So it's a pretty big number.
Very cool. All right, let's see. From Jeffrey, for Jefferson again. Thanks, great work and great talk. Do you take into account deduplication for content? That gets into the numbers as well. If they are found on multiple places in the archive.
Excellent question again, and a very fun problem. So yes, we are deduplicating when it is known to be an exact thing. Now the problem in academic or scholarly publishing is that there are a whole lot of versions, right? And they're not always the same thing. There's a preprint. There's then a pre-publication, which is usually like called the author's copy, which they might have the license to put on their personal blog or something like that. Then there's the version of record that is on the publisher's site. And then there's the edited, amended version of record, the retracted one. I mean, so we're getting all of them in many cases, and sometimes they are the same one, just in different places, like an institutional repository and an author's site and a publisher or something like that. In those cases, something like the checksum or, near, like very close similarity analysis can tell you that they're basically the same. And in some cases, they're obviously have changed a lot from the first draft or preprint to the final version of record. So we are doing deduplication, but it actually is much more complex than that. And so we try to sort of have something, we have a conceptual entity that is like the paper, and then there can be multiple versions of that, all of them with different, wayback URLs at the end of the day. And they'll have different hashes and things like that. So yes, doing it, but it's a fun problem. I mean, I don't have to do the engineering work, so it's fun for me, but probably not that fun for the engineers.
All right, let's see. Next question is for Nicola. Would you accept non-WARC web sources, like, for example, a collection of tweets in their JSON form instead of the rendered form?
So we certainly would like to. We certainly like to accept them. At the moment, our ingest policies and our infrastructure is set up just for WARC content, and certainly our access systems are set up for providing access to WARC files. So if we did take in a collection of tweets in their JSON form, it would probably take us a bit of work as to how we would make that collection accessible to researchers. I know that Andy Jackson's on the call, so we probably will see this scripted up before the end of the call into some sort of new ingest pipeline. So watch this space.
That's great. And I think a lot of us who, well, I don't know. I talked at an earlier table with somebody who was also thinking about or getting requests for donations of content and how random that can be. And I'm sure we've all had those stories where somebody's like, "Oh, got my HTML files from way back when, can we give them to you and can you put them in your archive? And the answer is probably no right now for a lot of us. So it's interesting to hear people thinking about the workflows and ingest process. So let's see, next one is for Ben, from Maria. I think your presentation was great. Do you get support from outreach education departments to promote the web archive, or is that something you are responsible for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't even think of reaching out to an outreach department. That's a really good idea. No, so far that's on our side, but again, there is a really good collaboration with the university. So we had 2 winter schools where there was a class of master's students who we had a workshop for a whole day with them. And this summer we have a summer school, this time again organized by the National Library on our side. So and that will be high school students. So I'm curious to see what the difference will be there in the different skills and ages of students. But yeah, I'm sure we'll get more experience there and keep on working here.
Well, and I was thinking your quiz was very fun, and I'm wondering if, you know, have a lot of people taken the quiz, or how are you using
yeah,
quiz?
that's a good, I'm not sure, but I use it as an icebreaker for the students, and I have some more questions, some more fun questions as well for the students. So.
Yeah, I really like that. I probably would fail the quiz though. Brenda asks, for everybody, in your opinion and taking into account your experiences, what was the difference between working on web archives with scholars versus the general public? How do they differ? Jefferson, do you want to go for
that? Sure. So, you know, the general public is usually going to go to archive.org or the Wayback Machine or maybe IA Scholar. So we don't have too much direct interaction with them. It's open access and they go through those mechanisms. We obviously get a lot of, it's not the topic of this session, but we get a lot of researcher requests for, you know, bulk data mining services or computational research support is what we call it. So, you know, that's a whole separate department. And we've done that. And also within the context of the project we're talking about here, we have given people big millions or tens of millions of the articles if they're going to do data mining. And again, yeah, they're PDF of journal literature, but they're from the web. So it's just another thing from the web archive. So that's been one way. An interesting case, maybe that people would recognize the person, is we worked with Martin Klein, who was analyzing sort of DOI infrastructure. Like when you enter a DOI, like the persistent URL, you know, it goes to this place, which goes to this place. So the sort of redirect hops that happens on the web. And so we crawled, you know, we use DOI as a crawling signal. So we crawl DOIs. And so you can actually use the Heritrix hop path kind of crawl log reports to understand like how the sort of plumbing of scholarly infrastructure related to persistent identifiers happens. And, you know, obviously some publishers want to send you through 8,000 redirects to not get you to the article or whatever their analytics collecting or data mining your traffic logs might be. So I think there's and that wasn't one we had thought of. It's just a crawl log from when we were archiving stuff related to the project. So I think there's some interesting ones. And obviously people are bulk mined the metadata, and we expect people to do, you know, bulk data mining on the citation graph when it comes out. So I guess the difference in relationships to those are sometimes it's a lot of data. So how do you get it to them? Do they actually know what they're doing? Like, you know, it's easy to be like, I want 1 million things given to me. And then they don't have any storage, or they don't have the technical expertise to actually crunch the stuff. Most people do, but, you know, so there's delivery of content questions. Do they have like working with them ahead of time to know whether they can even use it when they get it? Scoping, you know, questions around what they're asking for. Do they actually need something else or less or more? So those are all sort of aspects to working with researchers, regardless of the collections. But
did you want to go next?
So, okay, are we answering Brenda's question?
Yes, the scholars.
Okay,
General
so I apologise, I've just been informed that my cat's actually turned the TV on in the background, so Socks is actually watching the Euros at the moment, so sorry about that. So one thing that has surprised us is that when we have surveyed scholars and the general public into using web archives, we found that there's a general sort of level of non-appreciation of what a web archive is, even amongst the academic community. So we know that that is something that we have work to do on. But with particular scholars that we've worked with, quite often they have their research question in mind, so they come to the data set with a particular question. They need help to narrow down a tranche of the data, so they need us to filter the data to a certain extent before providing it to them. In some cases they have their own tools that they would like to run over the data set. In some cases they would like to use tools that we've developed. With the general public, we find that their requirements are often more for a close reading of websites, and they also have more of an interest in the curated collections that we've developed. So we understand that our curated collections can't provide academic scholars answers to their research questions. We see our curated collections more of as a shop window into the web archive, so it leads people in to see what they can do. We also find that members of the general public tend to have more of an interest in influencing the content of the web archive. So they'll be keen to nominate websites for us. They'll be keen to settle debates between rival website publishers. So we've been involved in debates about content on one local history website which is erroneous, and we've been told the reasons why, and that by making that website accessible in the UK Web Archive we're promoting it. So that's more of the style of input we get from the general public.
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of feedback from people actually using the web archive on the premises of the National Library, which is probably also due to the fact that it's so unpractical to have to come to the building to use it, and then maybe we might not even learn that they came and tried it. But I think for general public, people are often interested in just really knowing, is my website there as well? And a question that comes up a lot as a second question, well, what if I don't want to be in the archive? What if I'm against that? So does that mean you are stealing my photos or something? And that's where I try to steer it more on the positive side and say, well, we are preserving your photos and we're not stealing it because they are already on the internet. So that's something that I think people are often not aware with. And as I said before, for the scholar user experience, we haven't had a lot of exchange here, but an advantage of working with Olga over the past months is that she realized that on the data.bnl.lu websites, which is for open access data sets, we are still promising to upload data sets from the web archive since 2017. So that's really something we should update and really put things there that are available for maybe not just researchers, but anyone who is interested in data, because I think that's just then another approach, and where people don't have to come to the library necessarily. Great.
Yeah, and I think following up on that, there's another question from Sally about user communities for web archive collections, and which if you could target one particular user community for your collections, which community would that be and why? Any thoughts from any of you on that?
So I would shamelessly follow the money, and I would target the STEM research community, just because I think that it would serve us well to build up use cases for the web archive. And if we can say to our governing bodies, this is how we are contributing to research. You know, we can cite all of these academic publications that have been published using our data set. I think that would stand us in good stead for being able to open access a little bit more to the collections, and generally promoting the Web Archive and what we're trying to do. But of course, like all web archives, our user communities are everybody. So everybody from the from a journalist who's looking for a single document, to somebody who is a hobbyist reacher, to school teachers and school children, up to the academic community. So we have to cater for all of those user groups.
Yeah, our project is pretty, specific to scholarly literature, so it's definitely students and all the way through to K-12, and college, university, and postgrads, and all those things. I think some of them come to the Internet Archive looking for material related to education and learning and research. But one thing that we've been very cognizant of is making sure that we have access integrations with other places they would go. And the place that most of them go is Google Scholar. And so, no promises, but we hope to be indexed in there in the next couple of months. So I think that's a good one. Otherwise people are going through their libraries. So can we have integrations with OPACs or other things? Or buttons in the browser, Unpaywall does that pretty well. So just making sure that it's accessible in the places people go, as well as your place where they might go. But yeah, for us, it's definitely students and faculty and researchers.
Yeah, in my presentation, I had this really colorful Mickey Mouse graph with different levels of users, from being the closest to the Web Archive to maybe the general public. And I think the ones that are next to the library, who have the closest interest in the Web Archive, are other archiving institutions, other heritage institutions, where their areas of interest, their scope sort of touches on the web, and they know that they should be doing something there, but they don't have the means or the tools. So that should be really an easy way to collaborate here. And we already are in talks, like with the Audiovisual Archive, the National Literature Archive. So they have the lists. They would like to see their content from the web also preserved, and by that we have the key to have entire professional fields also represented then, or better represented, of course.
I'm seeing some fun chat about interactions with site owners, and I think that came through in Ben and Nicola, and I'm sure you, Jefferson, also have had a lot of interactions with site owners who are interested in our web archiving of them. And Ben, you had the artists that you interviewed, and Nicola working with the Man on the Beach folks, and I'm sure others, like all of us. I saw somebody said all of us have stories about talking to site owners about the collections, and to me, they're one of the biggest users. They just want to know where their thing is in the archive in a lot of cases, or why, or what we're doing. And there's a lot of communication that we end up doing at LC with talking to people and trying to persuade them to say yes to our permission requests. I'm just curious if you have fun stories or any thoughts about that you wanted to share.
So I have a really sweet story about. So when we opened the new building, there was like this open door, great big party day, and there was an elderly gentleman of 90 years who saw my presentation on the Web Archive, and he told me that he has a poetry blog which he has been keeping for 25 years now, and that he had been worried now for years what was going to happen with his blog, because he has I think 800 poems on that site, and he didn't know how to preserve those. And conscious of his age, of course, he was already thinking about that. And so he came by another 3 or 4 times just to check in the reading room if his blog is in the Web Archive. And sometimes calling me also to make sure that everything is there, and that's a really good exchange and a really good example of how to help someone. Yeah.
We also have seen an increasing number of people who are concerned about their legacies, and their web presence is part of that. So they're taking steps to make sure that that content is preserved. I like Ailey's comment in the chat here. So Ailey was once told off by somebody for asking for permission to make copies of their website open access. So we quite often find that when we contact our website publishers about making their archived websites visible, they say, why are you asking me this? Of course I'd be happy, but we have to ask them to sign a permission form, and quite often that's the stage where people back away, because we talk about third-party rights and making sure they're responsible for the content of that site. We kind of pass a little bit of the risk onto the website publisher. So that's the stage that it then becomes difficult to negotiate this open access permission.
Yeah, we've had some interesting ones. Obviously, you know, I think maybe the two categories of site owners that we're hitting in this project are the publishers. So the publisher's website, where we go to get the articles, that's been almost uniformly positive. If it's open access, they would love for it to be archived and to be accessible in as many places as possible. And we do direct in the IA Scholar interface to their website, so we're not trying to like send somebody to the archived copy instead. So that's been all positive. The other positive one, which was sort of baked into the thing, but I think was more successful than we expected, is, as I mentioned, we're using a lot of open scholarly infrastructure services. Like we're scraping the Crossref DOI, we're using like ISSN metadata and DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journal metadata. And when we crawl, we can often discover that their metadata is not current. Like maybe a journal went to a different website, or it got acquired by a different publisher and the URL changed, and their record is actually out of date. And since we're generating metadata or extracting it or whatever, as part of the crawling, we can actually go back to them and say like, hey, like your ISSN record is wrong. Here's actually the correct URL. We call it reciprocal metadata enhancement to make it sound fancy. But I think like that, you know, that's us. They're a site owner and they own the infrastructure that we're using. And in other cases, we've, you know, maybe accidentally impacted somebody's API, and so or found a bug or something in the API response. And so I think there's been successes for site owners that you wouldn't think. They're not a website creator or a, you know, a artist or something. They're an infrastructure provider, but our activity can help enhance their services just as their service helps our project. So I think that's been a success.
Great, that's awesome. And I think we are absolutely out of time. We ran over a little, but thank you all for the fun conversation. This has been great to wrap up our sessions. We have a short break next, and then we come back for the Trust in Web Archives panel, and then we'll round out the day with, you'll be hearing from me again at the very end. But thank you all, Ben, Nicola, Jefferson. Thanks for this fabulous session, and see you back on the floor.
Thank you, Abbie.
Thank you, Abbie, for moderating. Yep.
Thank you, Evan.